last week, Microsoft released its new quantum chip called Majorana 1. The real breakthrough here, and it's a bit complicated to understand, but I'll try my best. The real breakthrough is that they've used a particle called the Majorana particle, which was actually discovered by an Italian scientist many, many years ago, which allowed them to build a chip based on something called topological superconductors. Essentially, it fundamentally changes the architecture of how you build a quantum computer to one that is resistant against interference. So if I take a step back for a second and we talk about classical computers. So classical computers work with bits, right? So a bit can be either 0 or 1, and you can really do amazing things with zeros and ones. That's the fundamentals of how the machines that we use nowadays, the computers that we're recording this on, but even you can get amazing technology out of just zeros and ones and classical bits. I mean, we see what we've been able to do with AI, for example. And quantum computers, on the contrary, use something called qubits, which essentially they use the quantum properties of particles to leverage this property of superposition in a way that a qubit doesn't have to be a 0 or a 1, like a deterministic state. It can be in a state of superposition of 0 and 1 at the same time. And that basically allows people to solve different types of algorithms that basically with a classical computer you're not able to solve in realistic timeframes. Although they are fundamentally different types of computers, because sometimes classical computers will be better at other different types of algorithms. It's not like quantum computers are going to fully replace classical computers, but they're going to supplement what is possible to do with classical machines. Now, key challenge that people have had for a long time is that qubits are very sensitive to interference. And what I mean by interference is anything that can disturb the quantum state of a qubit in a way that you can get decoherence, which means that you ruin your quantum computation. And that interference can be anything. It can be from an atom that just disturbs the qubit, or it could be a photon, or heat is a key form of interference, which is why these quantum computers operate in the coldest places in the universe. And that is why you see them when you picture a quantum computer. You probably have seen that they are inside these massive casings that are purpose-built to overcome that interference. However, it turns out that those casings are not enough. And even operating at close to absolute 0, qubits still get interference, which is why quantum computers were built typically using incredible redundancy and complex algorithms to do what is called quantum error correction, which is nothing more than a clever way of detecting when an error has happened and correcting that error caused by interference. And so if we go back to Google and what the team there released about Willow, they basically released a new chip that was a refinement of the existing way of building quantum computers. So if you remember, it was better at quantum error correction, it had longer coherence times, which meant that you could reduce the number of physical qubits, that redundancy that is needed to build a logical qubit. And Microsoft here, what they've done is actually very clever, and it's almost lateral thinking, which is they told to themselves, if we try to keep refining the existing way, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just very hard to scale quantum computers in the way that they're built right now. And essentially, to build a useful quantum computer that is more than just a few qubits, our computers, I don't know how many bits they operate with, but it's more than just a handful. To build a useful quantum computer at the moment, you would need a computer the size of a football field. Like, imagine trying to build a casing at absolute zero the size of a football field. It's almost impossible. And so what they did with this release really is the culmination of 20 years of research. And what they have discovered is a new way of building quantum computers using what is called topological superconductors, which, if I try to explain in very simple terms, topology studies the properties of shapes that do not change under continuous deformation. It sounds complicated, but in reality, it's as simple as if you have a rope, for example, and you tie a knot to the rope, you can shake the rope, you can interfere with it, but at the end of the day, the rope still has the same shape. It has one knot, right? It's the same if you think of a mug that has the handle and a donut. Topologically, those two shapes are the same because you could morph it to be the same shape because it has only one hole in it, right? So without ripping it apart, you can get it to be, like, you can malleate it to become the same shape. So that is in a nutshell what topology means. And without getting into too much detail, basically what Microsoft have done is they have leveraged this property to create what they call topological qubits, which essentially are qubits that cannot be that easily disturbed because they can be shaken a little bit more. They're still very sensitive, but they can be shaken a little bit more than traditional qubits and still remain in the same topological state. And this is relevant because this reduces the number of qubits needed to build a useful quantum computer, which means that you can put a large amount of qubits in just one single chip, which is what we've been seeing. You know, that image of that golden chip is what then is put into those casings. And the computer or the quantum chip that has been released by Microsoft only has around 8 qubits, so not very large, but it's just a proof of concept so far. If we want to get into useful quantum computers, we need to push to the hundreds of thousands. I think we were talking about how many qubits would take to break RSA encryption. That's in the, sorry, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands, single digit thousands. But now Microsoft are saying that they can scale it into 1 million physical qubits in the next years. I don't know how many logical qubits that will translate to. But the fundamental shift that has happened now is that it goes from being a science, research problem into being an engineering problem. And that fundamentally changes the time frame that we are going to get until we see quantum computers. It was typically said that useful quantum computers, were decades away at the rate of improvement that we were seeing with traditional ways of building them. Now that research is concluded and that we have discovered so if you think about it, now we know what we don't know. And when you know what you don't know, it's much easier to go out and find out how to do it. So it turns into an engineering problem. Whereas before, it was very, wishy-washy research trying to find something that would give you the upper hand. Now they've really found it. It's it's really, really complex engineering that needs to go on. But now it's much clearer the path to get to a useful quantum computer. And that could fundamentally change. I mean, it could revolutionize many, many different industries.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I'd be curious to see. We've definitely experienced these things in the past, right? Like a science becoming a experiment, a technology going to full engineering and production. And I wonder what the rate has been in the past, right? Because that's how all of these things start as a experiment. Yeah, I'll be super excited to see how that develops. It's mind-boggling that they've managed to find a way of getting the qubits to not be interfered with, despite there being interference, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I explained
I
it in
find that hard
very
to.
yeah, I explained it in a very high level of detail. When you go into it and
Yeah.
you see like in reality, it's like these nanowires that they have semiconductor materials that they can have gates with electrons that flow through the nanowire, and then you put a superconducting material on top, and then is
Okay.
when you can see the Majorana like properties of electrons, and all of a sudden you get those superpositions. Like it's just mind-boggling. Like everything related to quantum mechanics is just super counterintuitive. It's super difficult to understand. I mean, I don't understand it. I can grasp at a high level, with analogies how it works, and it's super interesting. But my God, imagine having to like being an
To
expert
build
in,
that.
in quantum computer quantum computing, and like you said, trying to build that. Man, my brain would hurt every single hour of the day.
It sounds insane. I'm just imagining it in some weird way or form, like a layers of skin or like layers of a plant. I don't know if you studied that in biology, where you have the top layer, then you have like the breakdown of all the cells. It sounds quite similar, in terms of just like the structure of like having five different layers, and they all sort of have their key steps and they all somehow link together. But yeah, very, very interesting. Thanks, Juan. I'll pick your brain more about this in a second at lunch.